It's a good question. I'm going to use that as a springboard to ask another question to someone else, because I wasn't expecting to answer that question, but I'm glad you asked. I want to ask you a question, Dr. Higgins, about what's been happening in the past few years. According to the website for HRC, there have been 16 trans women who have been killed and this year, and I think there were nearly 24 last year. It seems to be a pattern that has been going on for several years. I wonder if you could tell us, if you could, what is behind this, if you know, what is motivating this, and what can we do about it?
Okay. All right. So here we go. I think what I think it's important for us to recognize. So, something that Alfonso said that I think is very important is when we talk about systems, I always like to frame in my work that all systems are connected in terms of oppression, right? So you can't talk about one system of oppression without talking about another. And I think that this is why it's so important, going back to this conversation and all of the research and all of the writing that I've done around Kimberly Crenshaw's work around intersectionality, is understanding that interwoven line of oppression and how white supremacy as a whole has worked to kind of interweave these systems to make it to where it's very hard to dismantle one, right? So when we think about what's happening to trans women, I say that to kind of step back and think about what's happening to trans women, specifically trans Black women. The idea that Black people as a whole have been we are in a way, or in some sort of concept, we tend to be expendable, right? And that's the word I want to use. We're expendable in a lot of ways. And so when you hear this idea of having to separate your identity, when we think about sexism, when we think about toxic masculinity, and we talk about all of these different systems that permeate around racism as a whole, right? Black women are not protected, so why would Black trans women be protected? When you start thinking about all those systems and how they work together, that is one of the reasons why those numbers begin to skyrocket. But then I start thinking about this other idea too, right? Kind of going back to some of the words that I've heard while we've been in this section together. It's this idea of trans women not being able to have a powerful voice. And this idea that when they do speak up for themselves, and again, I don't want to speak for trans women, but as someone who identifies as non-binary and sees the trend, right? This idea that I walk into a room in heels and makeup on and someone laughs at me, and when I say what's so funny, they look at me as if I'm the problem, right? Like this idea that when I stand up and I speak up for myself to own who I am, that now I become the person that should be attacked for that. I think that's ultimately what we find, is that there is this connection between the voice and the power that trans women have and carry in relation to owning their identities. And when we start looking at sexism and we start looking at the ways that toxic masculinity works, it's this idea to constantly prove that they can hold a powerful or a dynamic space in these conversations. And so I always like to say this, and then I kind of just leave it at this, that I oftentimes feel like the ones who are doing the murders, specifically of trans women, they are not specifically looking for freedom or for liberation. They are invested in systems of power and privilege. And I think that's what's ultimately happening is that in order to get rid of trans women as a whole, in order to, come down on non-binary individuals, or even think about someone like myself who identifies as very openly queer in the ways that I get looked at or the ways that I am received by even cishet, Black men and, white men as a whole, this idea that I somehow owe someone for opening my mouth or being who I am. I think I want to say this and then I'll stop. I think it's important to kind of think about this idea, behind Audre Lorde, right? And how she talks about, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies and eaten alive. I think that's what's happening, is that you have a lot of trans women who are standing up for themselves and saying, you don't get to define who I am. And they are being crushed into systems that are telling them that their lives and their experiences don't matter.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up?